Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, kicked off by Jane Austen July, a venerable BookTube event that's going on for the next 10 days. And we are reading our way through Pride and Prejudice with copious interruptions from yours truly. And we have reached a little bit of a tumult at Longbourn, where the Bennet family has a guest, and not just any guest, Mr. Collins, on whom the entail for Longbourn descends when Mr. Bennet dies. Mr. Bennet his family doesn't get to stay at Longbourn after he's dead. And since he doesn't have any sons, it goes to his nearest male relative, who is Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins' father and Mr. Bennet did not get along. It was a very acrimonious relationship. Mr. Collins' father has died, and young Mr. Collins has reached out in an attempt to offer the olive branch to mend fences here. He has another motive, but he hasn't got to it yet. He asks if he can come to visit Longbourn, his future home. He doesn't so much ask as say when he will be there and how long he will be staying. He seems harmless enough, full of himself, pompous, oily, but things go well. You would expect that if the recipient of the entail were coming to visit Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet would be in her very worst form, and she's not. She's perfectly nice to him, and he seems okay. The fact that he is pompous and unaware is catnip to Mr. Bennet, who likes nothing more than to slyly mock foolish people. It's a taste, it's an activity that he has communicated to his daughter Elizabeth. We've actually heard this out of her own mouth when she's a guest at Netherfield Hall. She says that's one of her favorite things to do. So Mr. Bennet is happy to have Mr. Collins there as long as he wants, because he's a foolish figure, and this will give Mr. Bennet amusement. And that's where we are now for chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all. But when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. They've already figured out, Mr. Bennet has already seen that Mr. Collins loves to talk about the wealthy woman who is showing him favors. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and with a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behavior in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he had himself experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses, which he had already had the honor of preaching before her. He's submitting his sermons to her ahead of time. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, that's her home, and had sent for him only the Saturday before to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability from her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighborhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relatives. She had even condescended to advise him as to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved of all the alterations he had been making, and had even vouchsafed to suggest some herself, such as shelves in the closet upstairs. "This is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?" "The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated by only a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and of very extensive property." "Ah," cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in point of true beauty Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton, and ponies. He worships her because sometimes she drives by his front porch. Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court. In other words, has she made a formal debut? Has she been presented at court? Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kinds of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself to be particularly bound to pay. You judge very properly, said Mr. Bennet, and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they a result of study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I will always give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet does not care whether or not Mr. Collins' compliments to Lady Catherine de Bourgh are off the cuff or studied. He doesn't care about that. All he wants is to laugh in his mind when Mr. Collins expands on it, because he knows Mr. Collins' answers will be ridiculous, as they are. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, the trash, he started back, and begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard? And if he does, Colonel Foster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow and hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Horribly rude. I don't have to like Mr. Collins, but that's horribly rude. She interrupts him to just flat out change the subject, just start talking as if he hadn't been reading. Lydia was bid by her two eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as an antagonist in backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. So it's a furtherance of the domestic scene here at Longbourn, where they have a guest, where Mr. Collins is the guest, and he's a fairly ridiculous figure. He's windy and pompous, and also incredibly toadiously obsequious to this Lady Catherine de Bourgh person. And that's all that Mr. Bennet wants. Keep in mind, he told us, we have been told, the only reason that he agreed to this whole meeting at all is because he had a strong suspicion from Mr. Collins' first letter that Mr. Collins was foolish, and he likes to store up his amusement at foolish people saying and doing foolish things. And that's we get the strong impression that's the only reason that he invited Mr. Collins to come to Longbourn in the first place. That the only reason he accepted Mr. Collins's conditions for that visit is so that he could secretly mock this guy at every turn while he's there. And that's really the whole of the chapter. The only point that I want to make is that this is extremely lazy, self-indulgent, and irresponsible of Mr. Bennet. This is someone on whom he should want his wife and his daughters to be on very good terms. So having Mr. Collins in the house should not be an occasion for mockery, even if he's mockable. But I'm going to have plenty of chance to jumping down all over Mr. Bennet later on. So that's this chapter. We'll move on. Mr. Collins is at Longbourn. That presents a drama all its own, and that drama is going to be enhanced once we become more acquainted with why he's at Longbourn. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll rejoin you next time. Thank you, BookTube.